Well, welcome back. In this video segment, we're having a look at the book of Hebrews. Now, Greg, you make mention of Guthrie a number of times in the notes, and he uses some technical vocabulary here. He uses the words teaching and exposition and hortatory and exhortation. Can you please just talk us through those and what they actually mean?
Yeah, Guthrie uses some terms with his structural outline that need some explanation. And there is a difference between, on the one hand, teaching, exposition, and on the other hand, hortatory and exhortation. Teaching exposition is well, it's teaching. It's taking the scriptures and explaining what the scriptures mean, whereas exhortation or hortatory, which is another word for exhortation, is an encouragement to obey what has just been taught. And so what Guthrie is saying is that the book of Hebrews is a mixture of those two types of writing. So you've got teaching mixed in with exhortation. So what the writer will do is he'll give the reader some teaching, and then he'll exhort obedience on the basis of that teaching, and then he'll go back to some teaching. And so that's the difference between teaching, exposition on the one hand, hortatory or exhortation on the other.
So what does Guthrie mean by the spatial argument in the book of Hebrews? And how does that actually tie in with the whole structure of the book?
Right, you have Guthrie's diagram, you have a series of his diagrams in your notes. By spatial argument, what Guthrie is referring to is that the book of Hebrews is kind of telling you the story of Jesus as he argues the case for obedience to the faith. In telling the story, he tells it spatially in terms of where Jesus came from. So he starts above the angels in chapter 1. In fact, in chapter 1, verses 1 to 4, which is one of the key Christological passages we have in the New Testament, we read in those first 4 verses, kind of like the prologue of the Gospel of John, that Jesus is the eternal God. He's the exact representation of God's glory. And then the rest of chapter 1 tells us that Jesus is above the angels. And then in chapter 2, spatially, he goes from being above and over all, he comes down to earth and he becomes lower than the angels, which means he becomes a man like us, in order that he might be taken from among men and chosen as our representative, as our high priest, and indeed as our offering. And then as our high priest, he is offered up and he goes back up into heaven via his death, resurrection, and ascension, and there offers a superior sacrifice. And so spatially, you've got Jesus starting above all, and then he comes down to earth, and then lives a perfect life on earth. And then as our high priest, as our representative, he goes back up into heaven after his death, resurrection, ascension, and offers that superior sacrifice. So that's the spatial argument. And that ties in with the logical argument that you have in the diagram where it says the Son is superior to angels in chapter 1, and then the Son becomes lower than the angels to deliver man from sin in chapter 2, and then the Son, on the basis of his identification with men, is taken from among men and appointed high priest, chapters 5 through 7, and then because of this appointment, he's able to offer a superior offering in heaven, which is chapters 8, 9, and 10.
Greg, can you talk us through the exhortations and what they're actually doing in the book?
Yes, again, you have this diagram as well in your notes, and you have 3 boxes, if you like, 3 rectangles side by side. In the middle, you have God, who through his word has spoken to the author of the book of Hebrews, who through writing the book of Hebrews speaks to the community. So that's the middle section of the diagram. Now, the exhortations are working both positively and negatively. So he gives warnings, and then he also gives positive encouragements. And the negative examples are linked to the warnings, and the positive examples are linked to the encouragements. The negative examples lead to punishment, the positive examples lead to blessing or promise. And so therefore what the author is doing is he's using the negative examples to persuade his readers not to fall back into the ways of Judaism and therefore suffer the consequences, but rather to follow the positive examples of the heroes of the faith, and therefore to endure in order to inherit the promise. And that's what that diagram is depicting.
Now, this final diagram looks really complicated. Can you explain how it actually works?
It seems really complicated because it is really complicated. But what Guthrie has done with his final diagram is simply put the previous two diagrams together. That is, the diagram that shows the spatial argument of the exposition or the teaching side of things, and then he's collected that and he's put that with the diagram we just went through of the exhortations. And so when you put them together, you have that final diagram. So spatially, you have the Son superior to the angels, and then becoming lower in order to suffer, enduring during his suffering, and taken from among men and going back up into heaven to offer the better sacrifice. So that's happening in the middle of the diagram. And then around the outside of the diagram, you have the exhortations. You have the both positive and the negative examples that are encouraging the believers on the basis of what's being taught about what Jesus has done and who Jesus is and how much superior Jesus is to anything that Judaism has to offer, encouraging them to obedience rather than falling back and therefore suffering the consequences of disobedience. So really it's just a combination of the two previous diagrams that you've had already.